Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Morningstar, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Scoliosis World. Obviously, I'm your host, and as always, Scoliosis World is powered by Back Genius. So thank you, Back Genius. This week, I thought, first and foremost, I'm repping my Detroit Tigers gear today. We got Game 5 tonight against Seattle Mariners, so go Tigers. Hopefully they can pull it out tonight. Sorry, Dr. Joy out there in Tacoma. But anyhow, so one of the things, obviously we're in October and we have Halloween coming up here in a couple of weeks. So I thought today would be a good day to do a topic on insulin resistance. Now, classically, I'm sure most of you, when you hear that term, are thinking, what in the world does insulin resistance have to do with scoliosis? Well, in and of itself, it doesn't, admittedly. However, insulin resistance causes and aggravates a whole host of other body problems. And it's an extremely complicating factor in patients who already are diagnosed with scoliosis, especially adult patients. And there are a number of reasons for that. So first and foremost, I don't have to tell an adult with scoliosis that typically speaking, their curve causes them pain in some manner. Okay. And usually that pain is recurrent in the same spots because the curve doesn't change. And so the same areas of the body are always compensating, and you always have sort of these breakdown points that are, the normal compensatory reactions to the curve. And so, of course, those compensatory areas undergo a lot of daily wear and tear, and then it's much easier for them to become pain expressive. But the reality is that those painful areas that a lot of adult scoliosis patients suffer from don't have just a mechanical or a structural contribution to those pains. There's also equally a metabolic component. Well, one of the chief hormones that can substantially increase inflammation in the whole body, let alone in those particular joints, is insulin. So just to give you an idea, let me kind of break down insulin very quickly as far as the 10,000 foot overview, if you will, of what insulin does. So insulin does a few things. So of course, everybody knows that insulin helps your body break down the carbohydrates from our diet and convert them into glucose and drive that glucose into our cells to be used for energy. But the problem becomes insulin has sort of a two-edged sword kind of a function to it. When your cells don't need glucose at a particular moment, that insulin then has to do something with that glucose. And so what happens? Insulin then signals for fat storage of that glucose. Problem is, insulin doesn't just transport glucose into fat storage. It also transports your hormones into fat storage and prevents you from using them. It also prevents certain minerals or shunts or transports certain minerals into fat storage also and prevents you from using them. So historically, for example, and let's say, some of the problems we have nowadays with insulin is due to the fact that we have a pretty constant availability of food. Obviously, in human history, that hasn't always been the case. In the relatively recent history, we've still had to hunt for food, grow our food, and we didn't necessarily have a constant food source. We couldn't necessarily just walk up to the grocery store and buy a steak, for example. And so insulin is one of those hormones that when the food supply is scarce, insulin's important because your body wants to reserve some of that energy and store it in your fat reserves for times where you don't have available food. And now your body can then tap into that fat reserve to burn that off for energy. But the problem is now we can eat pretty much whenever we want. And because of that, we have a perpetual insulin problem that's always getting made in concert with eating carbohydrates, particularly. And carbohydrates then get broken down into glucose. Glucose gets converted into fat, and we get fat. And of course, on top of that, insulin is pro-inflammatory. So any existing aches and pains that we might have, excess insulin only amplifies that problem. Now, the unfortunate reality is nobody really ever does the things necessary to take care of an insulin problem. So, to give you an idea of the problem, our body should, under normal circumstances, only make insulin in response to eating carbohydrates. However, of course, if we haven't eaten any carbohydrates, especially let's say in a 12-hour span of time, my body really shouldn't be making any insulin. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll have a patient where I am in strong suspicion that they have an insulin issue, and we'll do what's called a 2-hour response to glucose test. Now, that is not to be confused with some people have heard and done a test called a glucose tolerance test. They are very, very similar tests. The problem is, for example, if your primary care doctor runs that test or your endocrinologist runs a glucose tolerance test, they're actually looking at your fasting and then post-meal glucose. The problem with that is glucose doesn't tell you the problem, or it doesn't tell you if there's a problem even, because glucose, unfortunately, doesn't get to be abnormal in that scenario until the problem is already very advanced to the point that the person may be pre-diabetic or pretty much a type 2 diabetic. What I'm looking at instead is to say, okay, if you haven't eaten anything in 12 hours, your body should not be producing insulin. So a very low value, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, something like that. Very routinely, we'll have people who will come in for a fasting insulin blood draw, and instead of 0 to 3, 0 to 5, their insulin is 12. So, quite literally 2, 3, 4 times higher than what it's supposed to be when they haven't eaten anything for 12 hours. Well, that does a few things. As long as you have that excess insulin circulating around the system, it's harder to lose weight. And I get this question a ton, especially from my adult female scoliosis patients who are maybe coming up to perimenopause or in the middle of perimenopause or just immediately post-menopause. And they all say a similar thing. It doesn't matter what I do, I can't lose weight. And the problem usually is because they have too much insulin, and that circulating insulin is constantly signaling for fat storage instead of fat burning. Now, by contrast, when I haven't eaten a carbohydrate for long enough, under normal circumstances, my body, instead then of producing insulin, produces a different hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is designed to pull glucose out of your fat storage and hence absorb and resorb and shrink your fat cells. And that's how you lose weight, because now you're burning the reserves that you already have in the body. Well, sometimes that's not necessarily so easily done if you already are insulin resistant, as they call it. And the idea of insulin resistance, so take that person who has a fasting insulin of 10 or 12 or 2, 3, 4 times higher than normal. By default, they are what we refer to as insulin resistant. In order to start to notice weight loss or start to notice fat loss or start to notice better energy levels, to start to notice less chronic pain in those nagging trouble areas, I have to reverse that insulin resistance. And what insulin resistance means is that when insulin has been perpetually circulating around in my bloodstream for so long, your cells sort of just stop responding to it. And because it's so plentiful. Well, over the course of time, if you now limit your insulin production, the cells start to then say, hey, look, where'd the insulin go? I need my insulin. Come on, what are we going on here? And now your body becomes much more sensitive to insulin. And so insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance are two sides of the same coin. You want your cells to be very sensitive to insulin. That's how they're normally supposed to work. And so when somebody is insulin resistant, you have to give them things and do things and drive pathways that help them improve their insulin sensitivity so that they're not insulin resistant. Now, from a dietary means, there are a number of ways that we can accomplish that. First and foremost, one of the, I think, the easier things that we can do from a dietary perspective is to do what is classically known as intermittent fasting. Although I'm not a big fan of intermittent fasting. I'm not a big fan of the term intermittent fasting. I think the idea of fasting mentally becomes a roadblock for a lot of people. So rather than to call it intermittent fasting, I usually refer to it as time-based eating. And all that really means is that in a given day, from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, I'm creating a certain window of time, and that is the only window of time the whole day in which I can eat. Now, depending on how familiar or how adapted people are to this kind of an eating structure, some people will make that an 8-hour window. Some people will make that a 6-hour window. And then if you're like a real go-getter, you'll do what they call the warrior diet, and you're going to do a 4-hour window. Most of my patients will do a 6 or an 8-hour window. Sometimes it will start them at 10 to 12. Just depends how advanced the insulin resistance is. But most of the time, an 8-hour window or a 6-hour window is what they pick. Which then means outside of that 6 or 8-hour window, all you can have are water or tea. That's it. And of course, we encourage you to drink a ton of water, because obviously, as soon as you start fasting, or as soon as you have not eaten for so many hours, and typically once you have not eaten for about 6 hours, you now start to go through a lot of the and undergo a lot of the extreme benefits of fasting, meaning it improves your immune response. You start to have detoxification processes work better. You sleep better. You actually have better brain clarity and brain recall, and your brain actually just works better. You know, one of the things people don't understand is your brain wants to run on fat for energy as its primary fuel source. Now, the analogy I always use here in my office is that your brain is sort of like a newer automobile that runs both on regular gasoline or on E85 ethanol, which of course is a corn-based, fuel. Well, like your car or your truck, although it can run on that E85 instead of regular gasoline, if you use E85 or put E85 into your car, one of the things that you notice about your car's engine is that it doesn't perform as well. It suffers in its gas mileage, and sometimes it hesitates. You get certain repercussions of using E85 in a normal gasoline engine. Your brain works much the same way. Fat to your brain is like regular gasoline. On the other hand, if good fat and fatty acids are not available for the brain to run on, which your body converts into ketones, which is where the idea of the ketogenic diet and things like that come into play. If those aren't available to use for energy, then your body will use glucose as the backup fuel source. Now, again, it can run on glucose, but you now start to have a lot of performance issues brain-wise because you're using glucose instead of ketones or fats. And of course, those problems are mental clarity, disturbed sleep cycle, not to mention that burning glucose in your brain cells, your neurons, sort of one of the waste products of glucose metabolism in the brain are something that they call age proteins. And age proteins are what give you eventually dementia and Alzheimer's and all of these other terrible things. And that's because all of this waste product builds up in the brain because your brain's not eliminating it and detoxifying it enough. Well, guess what's the best way to eliminate those waste products? Fasting or time-based eating. So that's a very, very common lifestyle modification that we'll make in our office for people who are insulin resistant. Now, There are other things that can be done to speed up the process of recovering from insulin resistance. And off the top of my head, I think the best nutrients that we typically recommend as sort of like frontline sorts of nutrient interventions would be things like berberine, which is a very, very powerful insulin sensitivity promoter, let's say. Works equally as well as metformin in some studies. But the advantage is, unlike metformin actually can cause you to be B12 deficient, whereas berberine doesn't really run into that. Berberine is also antimicrobial to a large degree. A lot of integrative medicine practitioners like myself will use berberine for chronic infections of sorts. So it has a multidimensional purpose to it. Another very powerful one is something called alpha lipoic acid, or ALA. And then also cinnamon is very good. And then on the mineral side of things, selenium is very good. Certain types of magnesium, particularly magnesium malate or magnesium glycinate, are very good at promoting normal insulin sensitivity. And two other ones that are usually paired together in a lot of insulin focused supplements are chromium and vanadium. And so we use combinations of all of those in our patients. And there are a lot of studies showing that all of those, whether done in isolation or in combination of those, work very, very well to promote insulin sensitivity. But again, at the end of the day, it's kind of like all these GLP-1 medications that everybody, the big, flavor of the year, GLP-1 medicines. The problem is if you don't change your dietary habits, you're just going to put the weight back on and you're going to become insulin resistant all over again. And some of these people are actually gaining back more weight than where they initially started before they took the GLP-1. You still have to change your eating habits at the end of the day if you want to keep all of that off. So I did bring some studies here I'm going to kind of go through with you along this front, because I really think as insulin problems relate to scoliosis, it's more on the side of impacting hormone metabolism and impacting chronic pain levels, which, not coincidentally, are the two chief reasons as to why an adult scoliosis patient typically comes to see me, aside from trying to improve their curve. So, for example, let me pull a couple of these up here. I think one of the biggest, probably the best examples is in women who have PCOS, or polycystic ovary syndrome. The PCOS, I don't know if it's 100% of the time, but if it's not, it's 99 point something percent of the time. PCOS always has an insulin component attached to it, insulin resistance component attached to it. If you want to help PCOS or a patient with PCOS as much as you possibly can, it is imperative as a practitioner that you have to address insulin resistance in that patient. It's the only way they will improve on a consistent basis symptomatically. Now, for example, this is in the journal Nutrients. This is a systematic review. And like I always try to report, I always try to bring you a lot of the newest data that's out there, because I think, like any good practitioner should do, you should constantly be trying to, improve yourself, improve your clinical skills, improve your clinical delivery of care. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to be current on the literature. So this is in the journal Nutrients. It's a systematic review, which is one of the more powerful studies there is. And this was just published this year, 2025. The Role of Lifestyle Interventions in PCOS Management, a systematic review. Now, I'm just reading you right from the authors, quoting the authors here. Dietary interventions, such as food with low glycemic index scores, and I'll get into that in a second, caloric restriction, think time-based eating, high fiber, omega-3 fatty acid-rich diets, what did I just say the brain runs on, ketogenic diets, tomato, Mediterranean diets, antioxidant-rich foods, and anti-inflammatory diets all improve insulin sensitivity and hormone balance in women with PCOS. Physical activity, like aerobic and exercise and resistance exercise, enhance insulin sensitivity and help with weight loss and improve metabolic and reproductive outcomes in women with PCOS. So again, these are all things 50 years ago was just kind of commonplace. These are just things we all did. But now, in the information computer world, we're much more sedentary. Our jobs are, on the whole, are much more sedentary. And it becomes harder to exercise. It becomes harder to always, watch what you're eating. And, you're not necessarily burning off what you're eating. The reality is we're so infrequently and inconsistently active physically today that we really don't need to eat much because we don't really have any energy that we need to, we're not really burning anything. So if we're not burning anything, we shouldn't be feeding the system just for the sake of feeding the system, because that's kind of why we're at where we're at collectively. So that's PCOS management. Next one here, and I mentioned this nutrient for insulin resistance, alpha lipoic acid administration improves peripheral sensitivity to insulin and promotes the liver clearance of insulin, thus reducing the risk of diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in overweight patients. This is the journal Gynecological Endocrinology, published last year. So again, very recent study. Now, I'm going to get into what they're talking about, but these patients took 400 milligrams a day over 12 weeks of alpha lipoic acid. That's not even that big of an amount. We give usually people 600 or 1,200 a day. But with just 400 a day, taking the ALA significantly improved their insulin sensitivity and decreased their liver enzymes. Now, why that's important is because ultimately at the end of the day, your liver's job is to basically act as a filter for your bloodstream. It filters out all the junk that you're supposed to eliminate, marks it for elimination so that you can then excrete it. Well, sometimes if the liver is bogged down with a lot of that junk because it doesn't have the nutrients available to signal that junk has to be taken out, that junk just accumulates in your liver. It would be sort of like if you take a subdivision, and of course the garbage man comes once a week typically. And so let's say a Monday morning, the garbage man's supposed to come, garbage man doesn't show up. But of course, everybody's garbage is sitting out at the street by the curb, right? Well, what would happen if all of a sudden, week after week after week goes by and everybody's still bringing their garbage out to the curb, but the garbage man never comes? The subdivision is going to look like a mess. Your liver does the exact same thing. If your liver doesn't know, okay, I need to pick up this garbage so that we can eliminate it and get rid of it, guess what? It doesn't do anything with it, and it just accumulates. And it accumulates in your liver, so your liver gets inflamed, so your liver enzymes go up, and we have cascading issues as a result. So, for example, little segue here, but Back Genius makes a product called Hormone Detox, and it's very much a similar problem as insulin, where sometimes it's not that your body's not using a certain hormone, like estrogen or insulin or any of these other hormones. But if your liver is not eliminating the waste products from metabolizing that hormone, you're going to have a hormone problem associated with that hormone. We see this a lot in estrogen metabolism. A lot of people get immensely better with hormone symptoms just by doing a good liver cleanse, because we're facilitating hormone clearance from the liver. And that's what Hormone Detox does, one of Back Genius products. This is the same process, just in regards to insulin. ALA improves your body's insulin sensitivity, and it helps get rid of excess insulin. Very, very important concept. Like I said, study published a year ago, and that's an endocrinology journal. I'm going to save that one, I think, for last, maybe. Oh, here's another one. Same thing. Published in February of this year in Diabetes Research Clinics and Practice. Effects of silymarin, which is also, most people have heard of silymarin or referred to it as milk thistle. Effects of milk thistle on insulin resistance and sensitivity. Systematic review. Again, most powerful study there is. And this was literally just published a few months ago. what they found is that there is evidence that taking milk thistle can improve insulin resistance. Now, they don't get in so much into the mechanisms like the previous study did, but they really do show that there are improvements in insulin resistance in people who are type 2 diabetic and who have liver cirrhosis due to alcoholism. And that's just, again, that's just a liver cleanse. Milk thistle is a very common natural herb that you can get at any health food store. It's usually the cornerstone of any really good liver cleanse. And again, published February of this year. All right, last two things I want to kind of go through, and I'm going to sort of piggyback on and kind of segue back a little bit to exercise stuff. But one of the things here before I get to the exercise stuff is the idea that, I mentioned that most of the patients who come to see me for a lot of hormone and pain issues are adult scoliosis patients, right? But the reality is the age that these people are beginning to come in to see us, not just me, but people all across, conventional and, integrative medicine realms, are getting younger and younger and younger. And problems that we used to see in middle-aged people and older adults are now happening in teenagers. Kids, right? And again, it's the constant access to food, especially garbage food, fast food, food with all kinds of artificial colors, flavors, you name it. And of course, the toxic soup of a world we live in with all the pollution in the air and the water and our soil, all the chemicals we spray on our food. We're a hot mess collectively. This is actually, interestingly, published this year in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. And this is actually a group of physicians from the USA, Germany, and Italy published this study. Study's titled The Emergence of Chronic Diseases of Adulthood and Middle Age in the Young. And they call it COIDS, C-O-I-D-S, standing for chronic inflammation, obesity, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes, and depression syndromes. The noxious quartet of pro-inflammatory stress outcomes. Now, all that said, basically what they're getting at are things like depression, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure. These are normally problems that affect somebody who's 45 plus, 50 plus. The problem is these are now in 20-somethings. These are now in kids who are in their late teens. There is a reason why we have such an issue with, boys physically not developing like they should. They don't have the same muscle density like they used to. They're not as physically active as they used to. They don't play regular sports. They play esports. We have all kinds of layers of these problems, but a lot of the actual driver of these things is the fact that we overeat and we eat garbage and we eat carbohydrate-based food, not protein and fats. And that's really the main reason as to why insulin gets overly produced and perpetually reduced or produced in time, causing insulin resistance. For example, in my generation, unfortunately, my generation has to claim that, when I was younger, in the middle 80s, is kind of when the advent of fat-free foods came out. It's like I can remember when Hostess Twinkies came out with a fat-free version of the Twinkie, and everybody's like, oh, hey, great, it's fat-free, so I can eat the whole box. And, the sugar industry basically lobbied to paint fat like it was the enemy. And so nobody ate fat, and everybody ate sugar, and everybody ate carbs. And, of course, collectively, we blew up from there. But for a while, it was sort of hidden. And I think the reason it was hidden is because my generation and people older than me, when we were teens, we were very physically active. I was a kid who, when I used to play outside, it was one of those, well, as long as I was home or back in the house by the time the street light came on, I was just out all day, playing baseball in the neighborhood, riding my bike around the neighborhood, doing whatever, climbing in the trees, anything. We were physically active almost constantly, unless we were in school. And when I was in school, we still had recess, which they don't even have that anymore. So activity was sort of a big masking agent for a lot of this junk food. But the problem is we're not active anymore. So now eating all this same junk food and eating perpetually contributes to a lot of these problems, as far as the biggest contributor of these problems. But again, you notice the cornerstone of all of this, like they call COIDs, is what? Insulin resistance. Insulin resistance causes type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance causes chronic inflammation, joint pain, autoimmune diseases over time. Insulin resistance is what contributes to plaquing of your arteries and cardiovascular disease. Insulin resistance causes cancer. Most people don't understand that cancer cells use far more insulin than healthy cells do, because a cancer cell's metabolism is much higher than a normal cell. Depression related to insulin resistance. All of these things are terrible problems and are affecting us at a younger and younger age because we're getting insulin resistance at a much younger and younger age. When kids are eating things like sweet tart ropes and all this, you walk into any local gas station and you look at the food you eat, and it's unfortunately, I'm not even sure how it's classified as food at this point. It's just all lab ingredients. Whatever happened to eating a banana, for crying out loud, or an apple, or anyway, I could go on. Lastly, I want to get back to that physical activity, like I said I did. And one of the other cool things, and this is actually, so there's a lot of newer research that gives us a better understanding of a very specific nutrient that's classically marketed in the sports nutrition arena, called creatine. And in fact, when I was in high school and then in college, I was taught at that time, and the research out at that time, was that creatine is something that, yes, it was good, but it would increase your muscle volume by maybe 5% or so. And the problem is, in exchange for that increase of 5% in muscle volume, it's very tough on your kidneys. And so, a lot of people were sort of ambivalent about, whether it's really worthwhile to take creatine. And maybe it's something more reserved for a bodybuilder or something where, to a bodybuilder, a 5% difference might be the difference between winning and not winning a bodybuilding competition, right? So I understand that. But there's a lot of newer research showing that creatine doesn't actually work like we think it used to. And it actually isn't so tough on the system like we used to think. It's not hard on the kidneys like we used to think, even when you take it for long periods of time. And in fact, there are a few studies. In fact, my wife just printed one out for her patients showing how creatine supplementation in women, middle-aged women, actually improves their quality of life. It improves their PCOS symptoms. It improves their hormone metabolism, and it can lengthen telomeres, which is basically the ends of your chromosomes that actually sort of help predict what your longevity is, which is actually really awesome. And then another one here, this is in physiology research, published last year, 2024. And this is published by scientists in Iran and Japan. Supplementing creatine for resistance training can have more impacts on anabolic hormones, strength, and body composition. Interestingly, what they found, of course, is essentially taking about 5,000 milligrams a day or 5 grams a day of creatine. And they took it for 8 weeks. The results showed that in the group taking the creatine, they showed a significant increase in growth hormone, IGF-1 levels, testosterone, and decreases in cortisol and ACTH, which is adrenocorticotrophin hormone. The So let me back up and explain those. So especially as an adult, if I want peak muscle recovery and muscle growth, I have to have good growth hormone. I have to have good IGF-1 levels. For a male, those are going to typically peak around 23 to 26 years old and then gradually start to decline from there. Cortisol is a big driver of abdominal middle weight gain. Cortisol is a stress hormone. The problem is when we're constantly taking in food that's not good for us and we have constantly circulating insulin, guess what happens? Cortisol is also right there with it because insulin's pro-inflammatory. When you get an inflammatory response, your body responds by producing cortisol to adapt to the inflammation. Well, the problem becomes that cortisol also then works in tandem. So cortisol, when insulin is circulating and insulin is creating fat storage, cortisol is the one saying, oh, hey, wait, insulin, come over here. We're going to put that fat storage right here. Boom, right here, middle weight gain, right on your abdomen, right? Love handles, all that. So when you see people who, I have my own family members, like to look at them, they're otherwise pretty normal build, pretty skinny, but they have sort of like big pot bellies. And when you see people who are built like that, really what you're looking at is somebody who has a lot of excess cortisol and or somebody who has basically a congested liver bogged down with all kinds of hormone waste product buildup because they're not clearing it. Kind of disgusting, right? But the point is, with this particular study, supplementing with creatine helps because it optimizes hormone output, especially hormones that you're going to use for the benefit of physical activity. And now, while most of my patients aren't going to a CrossFit gym or they're not swimming, 100 laps in a pool every day, something like that, all of my patients who are here for scoliosis treatment are doing some type of active exercise program for their scoliosis. So in my mind, why not just give that exercise program a dual purpose? Why not help them improve their insulin sensitivity? Because that's also going to help their joint pain in time. If you can do both, all the better, because now not only did I just help them with their joint pain that they came in for, but by improving their insulin sensitivity, I may well have improved their lifespan. I may well have decreased their cardiovascular risk of stroke or heart disease or all these other kinds of things. I may well have decreased their chance of developing type 2 diabetes or PCOS. I may well have then now improved their brain function. Now maybe their memory recall is better. Now they're not walking into every third room thinking, why did I come in here again? We all have those moments, right? Well, that's all brain function. That's recall, memory. Your brain is one of the first things to become impacted by insulin resistance. So with that, happy Halloween, by the way. So my only suggestion for this Halloween is don't raid your kid's candy bag because, well, you don't want insulin resistance. Instead, unlike the whole urban legend thing of checking, apples for razor blades and all this other kind of weird stuff that went around when I was a kid, don't take the candy. Check your kids' candy. Limit your kids, especially for young kids. Starburst, Sweet Tarts, all these things that have all these artificial chemicals in them, artificial colors in them. Get rid of them. Get rid of them. Kids don't need them. We don't need them. Kids especially don't need them with their growing brains and their growing bodies. Especially when we know that insulin resistance is becoming a problem at younger and younger ages because they're eating all of this garbage. So, sorry for the gloom and doom sort of podcast today, but I felt like there was a lot of information within there that people can use, especially as it pertains to scoliosis. Like I said, it's not a causative agent in scoliosis, but I think it's one of those big things that definitely, I could take two people who have the exact same x-ray. One of them is going to be in a lot of pain from their curve, and one of them, they might have pain, but not really that bad, not any more than anybody else. And I think that missing link are things like this. This person who's in a lot of pain, maybe they have a lot of biochemical, metabolic contributions like insulin resistance compared to the person who's in much less pain and has a better quality of life. So if you feel like you're having a lot more pain than you should, or maybe compared to other people that you know, maybe this is really one of those underlying factors. And of course, that's something that I can help with. So that's all I have for this week. If you have any questions about this information or anything in any of my podcasts on the Scoliosis World, feel free to reach out to me directly at Morningstar, MMORNINGSTAR, at backgenius.com. Or you can visit the Backgenius website, backgenius.com is where you'll find me. And that's all for this week. I appreciate you tuning in. And if you like the information, please, please, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button on the screen. I would love to have you as a regular subscriber, so I appreciate that in advance. Take care. Have a good day, everybody.